terrorists on the con. Cam and I negate, contention 1 is triggering Trump's tariffs. As The Economist 17 writes, the Belt and Road Initiative is a series of interconnected infrastructure projects spearheaded by China. According to Telesur 19, the EU joining the Belt and Road Initiative would represent a sign of success to China and was a major diplomatic, economic, and political setback for the United States. This is critical because, as Harris of Politico finds in 2019, if the U.S. wants to fix foreign policy arguments with its trading partners, it has no options left but tariffs. If the European Union were to join the Belt and Road Initiative, Trump would lash out, placing tariffs on both the EU and China. First, the EU. Despite a few tumultuous months, Al Jazeera 19 reports that Trump is incredibly close to finally closing a trade deal with the EU. Unfortunately, Thomas 19 of Politico finds that the act of the EU joining the Belt and Road Initiative would be enough for Trump to place tariffs on the nations, sending their economy into a tailspin. That's critical, as Duesterberg 19 of Foreign Policy finds a move like this would push the already weak European economy into a recession. Bradford 19 of the Huffington Post confirms this, continuing that such a massive economic shock would push over 900 million people into poverty. The problems don't end with the EU. Tariffs would also be placed on China. As Piketty 18 of the SCMP reports, Trump won his 2016 election by painting China as a massive foreign threat, a strategy that got him the support of his blue-collar base. Pfeffer 19 of the IPS writes that the same strategy is Trump's best bet of winning once again in 2020. Thankfully, the public is not falling for Trump's rhetoric. Leisman 19 of CNBC writes that the number of Americans that see China as an economic threat has fallen by 17% since Trump's 2016 election. This is because, as Croucher 18 of Newsweek writes, Trump's rhetoric no longer matches up to reality. He does not have justification for his trade war. Trump's base will only support Chinese tariffs if they feel that China is a threat. And because his voters are no longer scared of China, Dennis of The Independent writes that Trump is giving up on his tariffs to keep his voter base in the upcoming election. Kromick of CNBC continues that Trump is open to creating an interim deal with China in the near future. However, as the Foreign Policy found just yesterday, the Belt and Road Initiative is at the center of Trump's trade talks. Allowing the EU to join the initiative would destroy Trump's incentive to negotiate, as it would allow him to paint China as a threat and justify his trade war, a strategy that would help him win the election the same way it did in 2016. A trade war between the US and China would be disastrous. Bray 19 confirms this, reporting that if the two countries do not reach a trade deal, a global recession will be triggered. And as McManus of Reuters explained, this would result in a push of 900 million people into poverty worldwide. Contention 2 is a NATO collapse. Chance 16 finds that America has taken notice of the strategic implications of the BRI as a means to separate the European Union from the United States. Right 18 confirms, finding that one of China's main goals in the BRI is to weaken Western unity and isolate the US. Walt 19 puts this into perspective, explaining that as the EU and China become closer through the BRI, the US will cease investing into the EU and subsequently NATO's defense and military. That's extremely crucial, as The Economist 19 finds that the EU will absolutely not be able to maintain NATO without the US, thus causing NATO's collapse and division. Even without the collapse of NATO itself, Kendall 19 finds that an increased Chinese geopolitical influence could be used to directly undermine the protections offered against China by Article 5. He furthers that China's increased political leverage could dissuade a country from executing their protective responsibilities in the case of Russian abuses, and they could use their economic control to stall a NATO response through transportation hindering. That point is critical, as NATO collapse or loss in ability would embolden Russia to invade the Baltics. While Russia has held back in the past, Art 18 explains that the collapse or diminishing of NATO would embolden Russia to claim much of the Baltics and invade. The impact is total warfare. As Peck 19 explains that the Baltics' only chance of surviving a Russian invasion would be to mobilize their entire populations of over 6.2 million people to combat a Russian invasion, causing mass casualties. Thus, we need.
Before we reach this, can I see, wait, is there a card that you had about the BRI leading Trump to stop investing in NATO?
Yes.
I'd like to see that. Oh, and also that the 17% reduction in people seeing China as an economic threat.
Sure. I want to get 17%.
Oh, we'll start running companies.
Okay.
We observed that the most likely way to return to developing relationship with BRI is a co-finance. As Ferrer of GW University finds that it is both the favored approach of major European nations and has been officially proposed by China. With the EU, China can expand the BRI in two ways. First, through funding. Quote from Politico finds that the BRI faces a $500 billion shortfall, as Chinese investment has declined 89% since the plan's inception. However, the Strategy Center reports that if Europe joined, it would be able to finance the plan's further expansion. Second, through new markets. Zhang of SCU writes that Europe has strong post-colonial spheres of influence in the developing world. Zhang furthers that with these connections in European capital, China can expand the BRI into 50 new African and Latin American countries, helping them in two ways. Contention one is overcapacity. According to the SCMP, China's main industries, including aluminum, steel, and concrete, are only able to sell 3/4 of the materials they produce. As a result, Game of the University of Arkansas reports that half these companies have become zombies, or deeply indebted, unprofitable firms on the brink of default. The ADB reports that these at-risk industries make up 68% of China's corporate debt. The CSIS finds that overcapacity is about to create a crisis, as there was a 54% increase in defaults last year, with hundreds more big companies expecting bankruptcy. Luckily, an expansion of the BRI can save them, as Islam of the World Bank finds that at-risk companies export 2/3 of their products abroad to fuel the BRI. For this reason, Freeman of Brown University reports that every 5% expansion of the BRI reduces industrial overcapacity by 14%. Without the BRI, China's economy will tank. According to Yafei, billions have already lost their jobs, and the failure of China's largest industries will thrust the whole nation into a recession. Alan of UPenn reports that given the extensive economic ties between China and the developing world, a Chinese recession would result in a protracted downturn in developing countries, pushing 90 million into poverty. Contention 2 is investing in the future. Africa is on the cusp of a revolution. While nearly all industrialized nations are set to shrink with aging workforces, Alan of Axios reports that the world's poorest countries will see their populations dramatically expand, tripling to 3.2 billion by the end of the century. With larger populations comes a tremendous opportunity for growth, but only if the economy can expand proportionally. Unfortunately, the UN estimates that population growth is greatly outpacing job creation, with 12 million Africans entering the workforce each year, competing for just 3.7 million jobs. The result is widespread youth unemployment, as Alan finds that in major economies like South Africa, over half of all youth are unable to find work. For this reason, the UN estimates that by 2040, Africa will face a shortage of 50 million jobs. The solution is external investment. Indeed, the IMF estimates that half of all economic growth over the past 20 years in Africa was the result of foreign investment. With the UN reporting that global foreign investment has recently declined 43%, China's ambitious Belt and Road Initiative comes at just the right time. According to Lou Binghamton University, the BRI has the potential to provide billions in infrastructure investment, accounting for 1/3 of all new projects in Africa. Fung of Forbes quantifies that if completed, the BRI would create 418 million jobs in developing countries, and on average, grow their economies by 3.35% in the long run. The BRI also has indirect benefits, as Lou finds that it fosters commercial relations between developing countries and China, allowing these countries to export $192 billion worth of goods to China and expand total trade by 13%. Policy decisions now will make or break Africa's future for the next century. The Hoover Institute explains that Africa's demographic window of opportunity is closing. As the longer that African countries lack sufficient investment to expand their economies, the human capital of their youth gets squandered as they don't find gainful employment, fail to develop relevant skills, and as a result, become locked into a cycle of intergenerational poverty. An expansion of the BRI can address this, allowing the developing world to harness its population potential and translate it into prosperity. As Dapp of the University of Maryland reports that if completed, the BRI will lift 40 million people out of poverty. Thus, we affirm.
Yeah. Where you guys like? Alright.
Face off.
Yeah.
Here we go.
Alright, do you mind if I have the first question?
No problem.
Okay. So your first and second contention, they're both reliant on an increase in infrastructure, correct?
No, they also relate to trade.
Your impacts are reliant on there being an increase in infrastructure, right? It's like your
Like
second impact.
to an extent, but like also if China increases any amount of FDI, like if a company opens up, they don't need to build a road.
So
that also
FDI
fosters trade.
it's about FDI, not just.
It's about like economic linkages. The BRI is really expensive. Can I have a question?
Sure.
So at the bottom of your second contention, you tell me that Russia's going to invade the Baltic states, that like everyone of military age is going to be recruited into the armies of these Baltic states, that there's going to be this enormous military confrontation.
Mm-hmm.
Will people die in that confrontation?
Yes.
On both sides?
I mean, probably, yeah.
A lot of people?
Yeah, I mean, more than that.
So it's going to be like this catastrophic war in Eastern Europe where millions die? How many do you think will die?
I would argue that on the side of like the Baltics, you're going to see a lot more deaths because again, they're mobilizing their entire non-military population. Compare that to like the Russian military. So I'd say it's a lot worse for the Baltics than Russia.
Okay, I mean I understand that to an extent, but there are also like lots of NATO troops in those states right now that you don't tell me are going to be pulled out.
I mean, we do tell you that NATO's going to collapse.
Okay,
So-
I mean, okay, but you would still say that people are going to die on both sides. It's not going to be like an easy war.
It's the nature of fighting.
Sure. All right. Do you have a question?
Sure. So, on your overcapacity, on your first contention on overcapacity.
Yeah.
So, how exactly are you going to funnel out, like, what kind of overcapacity are you talking about? Steel?
All industrial overcapacity,
Okay.
because the BRI infrastructure requires many different raw materials. So like steel, concrete, glass, aluminum. So like there's
So,
tons
is there a
of
way to get rid of
materials.
those without creating new infrastructure?
I mean, they're mainly used in infrastructure. What else could they be used for?
That's all I want to know.
Okay. Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
So you tell me that 17% people are less afraid of China now, and then you assert that that's the reason the trade war is less popular, because fewer people are afraid of China.
Yeah, that's a warrant.
Okay, so could they also think the trade war is a bad idea because they're getting hurt economically? Like if you're like producing things in America and Trump starts this trade war and that affects your business, couldn't that be a reason why you don't like the trade war as opposed to like, I don't think China's a threat?
Well, I'd say that you could look at the examples of 2016 and 2018 when tariffs were imposed and everyone knew that they were going to cause economic damages, but Trump was able to spin the narrative to say that China is a much greater threat.
Yeah, but that's an interesting point, because once the economic damages have been done by the tariffs, now these people are like, wow, this trade war was really bad. My small business has been hurt. I don't like tariffs.
He's imposed tariffs multiple times with popular support. The main reason it's going down right now is because.
But your analysis, I'm using your analysis against you. When he imposes the tariffs, the economic consequences don't come right away, they come later. Now that they're accumulating, these people who were once his base now realize that the trade war isn't benefiting them economically, so it's unpopular.
Again, our warrant is that Trump is able to spin the picture to make China look like a much bigger economic threat. They're investing in a security system that costs a lot to protect them from a greater threat outside.
Okay, sure.
And while we're thinking about, can I just ask the judges, because I entered your paradigm before I didn't have time, do you require front running in second assembly? I mean, in second rebuttal. Second rebuttal. Yes.
Yeah, we're gonna start from here.
Okay.
Start from here. It's gonna be down there. The time starts now. Started the top. The majority of their case is based on the idea that joining the EU, joining the BRI is going to lead to the creation of more infrastructure. What's really critical to realize is that in the middle of a trade war, it's impossible to create a lot more new infrastructure. What Smith 18 finds is that in order for Chinese contractors to actually create infrastructure, they need US dollars. That's because the US dollar, the global trade currency, is more profitable for these contractors to use that currency. That's critical, because Swaminathan finds that the way that China gets its US dollars is through trade with the US. They export to the US, get US dollars in return. That's really, really important, because what Swaminathan concludes is because of the trade war, the value of the BRI projects has fallen 42%, which has been a massive detriment in the creation of new infrastructure. That's really critical, because the way you're going to evaluate this round is whoever solves the trade war. If infrastructure is not able to be created sustainably while a trade war is going on, the only side that's going to be able to create a long-term solution for anything that they're talking about is the side that actually allows infrastructure to be created and the side that solves the trade war. But then, on their first one about funding, we'd also say that the trade war is going to be a prerequisite to this argument, because the CNBC finds, like, a few days ago that because of the trade war, China has experienced a 90% decrease in their foreign investment. That's really critical. No one wants to invest in a volatile global market during a global recession. That's our impact of 900 million people in poverty. But then it especially takes out their second contention on foreign investment. But then let's talk more about funding. Camo 19 finds that the BRI is full of white elephant projects that provide no actual economic benefits due to corruption and a complete lack of evaluation of projects. It's really critical to realize that the EU is not going to give the BRI more of their funding, because the majority of the projects in the BRI are just used for Chinese geopolitical influence. They're not profitable. The EU has no interest here. But then on their first contention about overcapacity, there's no reason why the EU is going to uniquely solve this problem. China has already invested $1 trillion in creating more and more infrastructure. Overcapacity has stagnated insofar as they're not going to create $1 trillion of new infrastructure, make them prove why all of a sudden overcapacity is going to go down. But then the EU specifically is not going to take in any more Chinese steel, because what the European Parliament in 2017 finds is that because countries are only willing to accept limited amounts of Chinese production, the only way China can address overcapacity is through internal reforms. They need to stop subsidizing these state-owned enterprises. All that they're doing is just allowing these state-owned enterprises to continue to game the system and give them an excuse
to create more steel. That's why Mayfeld of the RFA in 2018 explains that the problem only exists because companies have large production lines that are just waiting to be opened up in case of opportunity, which is why production always increases when prices go up, rather than actually solving the overcapacity problem. But then at the end of the day, the part of the EU that hasn't joined needs the least amount of infrastructure. They're not going to solve anything. But then Holland 17 continues that if they try to go for the argument that they're going to increase trade, Holland 17 continues that the BRI trade routes are actually more expensive and time-consuming than alternatives because, for instance, BRI railroads pass through countries that don't use like the standard gauge railroad system, so they have to constantly switch train cars. It becomes harder and harder to create more infrastructure. But then let's go on to their impact. First, Smith 18 finds that other G7 countries have more debt and nothing has happened to their economies yet. China's not going to get thrown into a massive recession. But then second, China's going to recover faster because after the 2008 recession, China was the first one out of it. Let's go on to their second contention. Again, cross-apply the CNBC evidence that finds that during a trade war, China experienced a 90% decrease in the amount of FDI that they had. That's really, really critical. The only way you're going to solve their argument is by getting rid of the trade war. We're the only one that allows that to happen. But then on their impact, I'd say that if we win even a small chance of a recession, we're still going to trigger their entire impact by hurting the vulnerable the vulnerable developing nations' economy, which would still throw all of these young workers into a cycle of intergenerational poverty.
Alright, we're gonna take that time starting in our case, first on the trade war weighing, and then I'm going to be going down to their case. Alright. Judges ready, opponents ready, everyone ready? Start on their weighing on the trade war. They tell you that the trade war is the most important. We tell you the trade war is always ebbing and flowing. Trump is increasing tariffs and decreasing tariffs. That means ultimately we tell you that whatever team can provide additional funding despite that trade war, which comes to the EU, is going to win because there's still a scalar impact. More projects are built with more funding from the EU. Then they tell you that they only get US dollars from US trade, but that's not true because the New York Times tells you they currently have $3 trillion of treasury holdings. I mean, they still have money even if they don't have increase in trade. We also tell you have to look in the long term. Eventually there'll be a new president. Eventually there will be new conditions of trade, which means eventually they will recover from this trade war, whereas our impacts are about long-term development in Africa. Then they tell you that they're not going to invest because the products are bad. But we tell you, A, according to our lane card, it mitigates risk because if China is investing some and Europe's investing some, they both have to put less in and get more profit out. But then second of all, they tell you another reason is that they think they can expand their own trade and influence via the BRI. Then go down to our turn on overcapacity where they say it makes trade more expensive. First of all, we say this is short-term. They have to eventually adapt to these new transportation systems. But the World Bank tells you in the long run it decreases transport times by 12%. Then go to their case, start on tariffs. They tell you that right now we're closing in on a deal with the European Union for tariffs. They tell you that first of all there's a reason for that deal, and that is economic reasons, and that's true. Then they're not actually fundamentally changing that. But then we also tell you that with Britain, France, Italy, Australia, other Western allies joining AIIB, China's main bank, and they face no retaliation, is historically not true. But then second, Granted Global Risk, they tell you there's no other strategy to containing our allies. That's just not true because Granted Global Insight tell you we take literally the inverse strategy, and we did it with Italy, which is using carrots, not sticks. We expand economic linkages with Europe to dilute Chinese influence. That's another strategy they can take. It's a strategy they took with Europe. Why can't they do that? Then third, we tell you these tariffs are specifically improbable because CNBC tells you America is very dependent on Europe and they know it has devastating economic consequences. They tell you in their second contention that Trump is prioritizing the 2020 election strategy. This would be devastating for him if he causes a recession in Europe. And then B, according to Politico, we tell you that China is not seen as Europe is not seen as an adversary to the American public, and as a result, it would be really unpopular to have any trade with them. And in fact, the Senate could even block it with Republican and Democratic support. But then ultimately, we tell you that trade benefits to the EU, if they occur, could still outweigh these detriments from tariffs. Then, go to China. First of all, they tell you that he cares about a 2020 strategy. This means that if it causes economic harm to the United States, that's also going to cut into his election strategy. Then they tell you that right now, the perception of China as a hegemon is decreasing. But we tell you that their card says it was still always below a majority who wanted these tariffs, which means that it's still always unpopular, it still always hurts him. But then, they tell you that he's giving up on tariffs right now. But they don't tell you how much this deal will do. They need full solvency on the trade war because they're saying the trade war is going to cause a recession. If they don't solve for report, that recession might happen in either world. But then the SCMP tells you that this long-term deal is not going to occur, and that Trump and Xi are both still planning significant escalation. This evidence is from this month. You prefer it, but then they tell you that you're going to destroy the incentive for this deal when the BRI comes around. But the BRI already exists, and we tell you that it's so marginal. How much does the American public actually know about the Belt and Road Initiative? They don't have no evidence saying there's going to be enough to totally shift public opinion. That's ridiculous. Then, go to their second contention, they talk to you about NATO collapse. They say Trump's going to pull out and reduce funding. Harding the Guardian tells you it's not true. We have a formal and binding treaty in the Senate. Trump can't pull out with executive power. We need senators' votes. Right now, there are only 2 votes in favor. Then second, ABC News tells you take an entire year. In that year, funding would be kept up. And then third, which means it's a really bad way to retaliate. Third of all, it would be political suicide. Foreign Affairs tells you 75% of the public favors support for NATO. And Jim McQueen tells you, even without the U.S., NATO will endure because EU countries can boost their own funding. Then they tell you that they also could disrupt trade routes by accepting ports. We tell you these EU countries are powerful. They can deny Chinese influence. In fact, China needs them to fund the Belt and Road, so they are the ones who have the leverage. It's not China that has the leverage. Then they tell you it's going to cause a war. A lot of reasons not. We tell you, A, it would cause Russian casualties as they continue to cross. That would leave the U.S. untouched, the sole superpower, while Russia is significantly facing casualties. Second of all, Russia only makes limited incursions because it would use tons of resources. Third of all, there's a nuclear deterrent with France and the UK having nuclear weapons. Then fourth of all, it would be devastating economic consequences for them. We tell you, and if you whip people out of poverty in Africa, you produce African violence. That's where the most violence occurs.
Yeah. Now get to the question.
Sure.
When did China pull out of the AIP? When did the EU join the AIP?
Well, the EU as a whole did not, but select countries have joined since 2016 to 2018. Sure. So, okay. On our case.
Sure.
Okay. So you talk about the trade war. Is this reducing investment into infrastructure, right? So is that trade war eventually going to subside? And after the trade war, is EU funding still relevant to?
Yeah. So the Swaminathan evidence I read in the rebuttal says that the value of infrastructure projects is about 42% and preventing China from building new infrastructure.
But that's under the current trade war.
Yeah.
And I'm saying if that trade war eventually ends, which it will, in the long
In your
term,
rebuttal, you
why is the
literally
funding
tell
not?
me it's not going to end.
Right, I tell you, under the Trump administration right now, we think that Trump is still going to put on tariffs. But as I say in my rebuttal when I'm frontlining your case, I say in the long term there are going to be new presidents, new administrations, and if it is true that the vast majority of the American public does not want this trade war, which your card says is true even before Europe joined the BRI, and has been true for a while, what we tell you is if at the point that that's true, in the long term, don't you think this trade war will eventually subside and China will have more means to provide infrastructure?
I mean, isn't your impact on
EU
cyclical? No, the impact. Cyclical poverty isn't that inherently short-term anyway?
Not in sure. We say that there's some urgency, but we say that we're talking about between now and 2050. Between now and 2050, the population is going to double. Between now and 2100, the population is going to triple. But our point is, so as long as we are making action in the near future, that's important. But even if not, we tell you that even if it is true that there is less funding now because of the trade war, the EU adding funding still helps the initiative. Just because it has reduced China's ability to pay for infrastructure, the EU providing trillions of dollars and more funding, that still builds infrastructure.
So why would the EU get more funding?
Okay, sure. So we tell you there are a few reasons. One reason is because the Liang card tells you when they invest with a partner like China, it's specific to China, through what's called a third market cooperation agreement, which is what we're saying is the most likely way they invest, it reduces risk. So they are putting in half the funds, China's putting half in the funds, which means that they don't have to put in as much, and because it's inherently risky to invest in the poorest countries in the world, that's one reason. Another reason because they think they can expand their geopolitical influence through expanding trade and economic relations.
You already had your rebuttal.
Sure. You asked me.
So with the risk of would the diminishing of the risk through the agreement be enough to outweigh the amount of risk created by the agreement?
So we say it is because our evidence says a couple things. One, past precedent. So Australia, Japan, and Canada have all joined through this means of third market cooperation agreements. And so, wait, can I say the second reason? The second reason we say it's enough is France and Germany have specifically expressed interest in doing this type of agreement.
I'd say they do it already instead of cutting their FDI by 90%. We're gonna take the remainder of our
Everyone ready?
Yep.
Okay. Starting on their case at the top, remember they tell you that this entire thing is going to be a long-term impact. Their impact disproves that they are winning the long-term argument. If poverty is cyclical and we push 900 million people into poverty due to a recession, you're pushing that many more people globally into poverty, which they say is cyclical in a lot of the places where the poverty is going to get much worse. Which means that you can add their impact onto ours. That's really important because as soon as we prerequisite our argument, because as soon as you have the trade war, you see funding go down 90%. That's really important. That's the foreign investment card, which tells you that as soon as the trade war happens, as long as the trade war is happening, you're going to see investment go down 90%, which means you don't solve for any of their impacts without solving for the trade war. If you want any investment, you have to solve for the trade war first. That means that even if there is a small chance of a recession as well, you're going to see no investment because no one wants to invest into a recession. That's important because insofar as we gain any access, a small chance of a recession, you're going to prerequisite their entire argument on any kind of funding, giving us access to cyclical poverty on the 900 million that we impact out to. That being said, let's go on to our case. Remember what we tell you. Trump voters only support his tariffs that they feel like they are protecting them from a greater Chinese threat. But as CNBC found just yesterday, the number of Americans who consider the threat is down 17% in 2016, and Trump has nothing to point at as his justification, as China seems like it is being controlled. This is why Trump is currently giving up on tariffs and coming to an interim deal with China. However, when you vote affirmative, you allow Trump to point to justify his tariffs with the fear of unprecedented Chinese hegemony, which Pfeffer 19 tells you he will do to win his election. This gets rid of his incentive to negotiate and allows the recession to happen, pushing 900 million people into cyclical poverty. They give you 5 responses. First, they say that they give a ton of responses about the election. You can group them because our Pfeffer evidence is really strong, saying that he will always prefer the tariffs in order to win his election, which means that he's always going to try and look for something to blame Chinese hegemony on in order to win his election through tariffs. And then secondly, even if he did want to do something with the economy, he can always spin it to an economic threat. This is what he did in 2016 and 2018 when he said that China was an existential economic threat to the United States, which allowed him to place his tariffs. Secondly, they say that all these countries have joined the Asian Infrastructure Bank. Here's the thing. The majority of the EU joined before Trump got elected, which means he couldn't point to it. Thirdly, they say that the Senate can block it, but the tariffs are an executive order that Trump puts on, which means he's always able to do what he needs to do to get elected, which is imposing these tariffs. And then fourthly, they say that a deal is not going to happen. But our CNBC evidence from literally 2 days ago says that he is coming to an interim deal right now. And finally, they say that tariffs are unpopular. But remember, he won off them in 2016. He can win off them again. That's our Pfeffer evidence, which is extremely specific, saying that Trump's best bet of winning the election is going to be placing tariffs. That's really important because insofar as Trump continues his tariffs, insofar as Trump doesn't even have to place new tariffs, that a Brain 19 evidence says that he continues the trade war, you're going to see a recession. You're going to see no investment, no infrastructure created because you need US dollars for infrastructure, so they're not going to gain any impacts off of that. You're going to be pushing 900 million people into cyclical poverty. On top of that, really quickly on their case, remember that we still link into trade times because any increase in infrastructure from China is typically not standard gauge, which lowers infrastructure, which increases trading times by 50%.
We're gonna do Wang at the top and then right here. Everybody good? Actually, wait. I want to take 10 more seconds.
Continuing prep now.
Okay, now we're good.
At 117.
All right. They have 2 pieces of optics in the round. First is tariffs on China, but we tell you that the trade war has been going on for a really long time. It's not unique. It ebbs and flows. And we would also tell you that China has $3 trillion in reserves. They don't need this USD. Then they tell you that Trump's going to put tariffs on Europe. But this really isn't probable. They never respond to the fact that the United States is dependent on the European economy. So the U.S. economy is also going to go down if Europe gets hurt. And they never respond to the fact that most Americans have no idea what the BRI is. It's not going to be worth tanking the American economy. People don't want that. And that's why when Italy joined the BRI in 2016, when Trump was president, Trump offered increased aid to Italy, not more tariffs on Italy. Their arguments are probable. But even if EU does enter a recession, it's only going to be a short-term recession. They tell it's going to thrust 900 million people into poverty. That's only if it's as bad as the 08 recession. They never proved that at any point in today's round. But even then, we would tell you that long-term growth is much better because these people can recover from recession, but they can never escape cyclical poverty without external investment. We tell you that once the European Union does recover eventually, even if the tariffs happen, then they're going to still work with China to invest in Europe. We still access all of our impacts. We tell you that the African population is expanding at an astronomical rate. There are 8 million too few jobs each year for the African population, and they need external investment to solve that issue. You can weigh this on urgency, because right now opportunities are slipping away. It's the demographic window of opportunity. To rescue this generation of Africans, we need to stop them from squandering their human capital and falling into poverty. We need this external investment. It's coming from the BRI. What we tell you is that the more funding the BRI gets, the more countries it goes to, the better it will be for these people, and the EU provides both of those things. It provides a historical relationship through the post-colonial spheres of influence, and it provides the money. And the history confirms our argument as well, as when high-income countries join the BRI, countries like Japan, Australia, and Canada, they become co-sponsors with China in what's called third market agreements, where they invest alongside China into developing countries. When low-income countries join the initiative, they receive investment. That means that the fiat most likely means that Europe invests alongside Africa, and EU banks already have available $2.5 trillion in funds to invest in Africa. It's most likely they would do this through the BRI, and the BRI, we tell you, has amazing impacts. It's going to create 418 billion jobs, and it's going to increase the economies of these developing countries by 3.35% in the long run, giving them a way to actually escape cyclical poverty and not just remain in it forever. And they tell you that it's going to be risky, that the EU won't be able to invest because there's all these risks associated with the investing in the BRI. We tell you that the EU does want to invest for a number of reasons. First, they're able to share risk with China, whereas before China had to invest all $100. Now Europe invests 50, China invests the other 50, Europe invests half as much. They still get a lot of benefit. And we tell you that overall it's going to allow them to enter into countries that were now mainly BRI, Chinese influenced countries. Now they're able to invest in those countries alongside China. At the end of the day, the weighing in this round is really, really simple. We would argue that overall our impacts are not only short-term, but long-term. They're short-term because we need the investment right now, because the population boom is happening immediately. Without the investment immediately, these young Africans will get older and they will not get the jobs that they need because the investment isn't coming into their countries. And that means that they're eventually not going to, people don't go to medical school when they're 60 or 70 years old. So what happens is, if they don't get the investment now, they're still going to fall into intergenerational poverty, but it's long-term as well, because we argue in the long run, EU will invest in the initiative, and in the long run, we're going to see the population boom addressed by this increased investment. For these reasons, please affirm.
Ready for it. You guys ready for it?
Yeah.
Y'all have a question?
Sure.
Yeah. So, your part about 900 million people being thrust into poverty is about the 2008 recession, no?
Yeah.
It's comparatively, yeah.
So how do you know that, a tariff Trump passes is going to create a recession as bad as 2008, which was caused by, many structural reasons?
That's what you don't respond to. Because what we're saying is that Trump does not need to pass a specific tariff in order for this impact to happen. It's just that Trump's negotiations need to end.
Wait, but what if Trump, so it can be any tariff?
No,
The issue is,
the rate of the trade war continues to escalate.
Oh, but I thought the negotiations were with China. The negotiations aren't with Europe.
And
No,
we
right?
didn't
We didn't
extend the
extend
Europe argument, but
We're
that's how
extending-
you responded to
China
it.
has a trade war right now. Trump is negotiating to get rid of his incentive to negotiate.
Okay, but we told you, we said that it ebbs and flows, right? That's the evidence that we read
So,
you.
yeah,
The
and
trade war is
we'll
not unique. He negotiated a couple years ago too, and then it
But
fell
the
apart.
only impact you extend on your case is the short-term one of intergenerational poverty.
Our
So
idea
I
is
would
that you're
yeah.
characterizing, first of all, you're characterizing short-term differently than we are. We're talking about population booms between now and 2100. Our idea is that we need that at some point in that period for us to manifest an impact. But second of all, on the short term, we tell you that even if you thrust people into poverty now, you recover from a recession a lot better than you recover from structural issues in your economy. So even if you thrust people into poverty, they'll recover because they'll have stimulus packages, because they'll have investments, they'll have all these things. But when you fundamentally are not creating enough jobs, that is going to make you a lot worse off in the long term. That's right.
So the stimulus, let's talk about the recession, right? The stimulus packages, they come from a country having a lot of capital, having a lot of stresses on the international markets, aka tariffs. Doesn't that create a lot harder environment
There's always
to recover from
the
a
problem
recession?
is your arguments there's always going to be a certain degree of tariffs in the international space,
Yeah,
right? There's
certain
tariffs
degree.
right now. China's still investing right now.
You're
People
making
are
it
getting
seem
lifted out of
we
poverty
have a
right now.
normal amount of tariffs right now. We have an insane amount of tariffs right now.
And
which
the
is why-
BRI is still it accounts for 1/3 of all infrastructure in Africa right now, despite
What
an
does that
insane
have
amount of tariffs.
Okay, no, what I'm saying is that right now, the tariffs prevent a lot of capital and a lot of the stimulus packages that you say are so good from actually happening because they get
Our
huge
point
stresses on the global economy. It takes a lot longer to
Okay.
recover from a recession if you have something like this.
Obviously, there's going to be some time period in which they recover, but we're saying that tariffs are only on certain countries. So if the U.S. is putting tariffs on China, right, and they hit a recession, China still has trade with a lot of all of these 120 countries they're connected to, including developing and developed. They still are going to have trade with the EU because you're not extending the EU point. They still are going to have trade with all of these other actors. So our point is that, and they still have the $3 trillion of reserves of money that they have. Our point is that, of course, the recession is going to take some period of time to recover to, but even if it takes 5 years to recover from that recession, they still eventually bounce back from that recession in a way that you don't bounce back from structural issues in your economy. That's right.
So it's basically just going to be our case and their case. Is everyone ready?
Yeah.
Time starts.
Now, they make a strategic mistake in second summary when they try to go for the impact about intergenerational poverty. They literally tell you that most of the African economies have still not recovered from the 2008 recession. That's because they don't have the economic structure to withstand that kind of global recession. That's going to be really critical because we're going to weigh our trade war argument against this. They say that it's short term, so it doesn't matter. I'd say it would still plunge the African economy or the developing world economy into a big recession that they can get out of right away and create that cycle of intergenerational poverty. But then they completely cold drop our second war in China. That's the only one that's extended. Let's talk about it again. What we tell you is that right now Trump is forced to negotiate because the only way that his base supports tariffs is if they feel that they're being protected from a larger China threat. Otherwise, they don't want to go through the economic harms to deal with those tariffs. That's really critical because the February 19 evidence tells you that Trump's best chance of winning the election and the way that he wants to win the election in 2020 is by using the trade war. That's the spearhead of his strategy. It's going to be really critical because if we prove that tariffs continue in our world and a trade deal isn't reached, one, we push 900 million people into poverty, but also we trigger their impacts about intergenerational poverty. Let's go to their case. The two prerequisites are going to be really important here. First is the funding one. We tell you that 90% of foreign investment has decreased from China because of the trade war. They say that countries are going to decrease risk by working together. I say it should have already happened, but on top of that, you're going to weigh like the Chinese recession argument because they never quantify exactly how much risk they're going to get rid of. We actually give you a number, but then on infrastructure creation, it goes cold drop in summary. But we say that you're going to prefer the Swaminathan evidence because it's shown that the trade war literally stifles the BRI and prevents infrastructure creation. The value of projects fell by 42% and prevented the creation of more infrastructure. They can't access any of their case if infrastructure isn't created. That means the only side you can vote off of is the side that gets rid of the trade war, because if a trade war is going on, long-term infrastructure won't be created. We're going to link into their impact about intergenerational poverty. That's the way you're voting in the route.
Okay. We're going to run the rest of our... Wait. Opponents ready? Live judges. Start on their weighing. They tell you that they're going to create intergenerational poverty, but that's not true, because we tell you, even if they thought people into poverty, people recover from recessions different than they recover from structural issues in an economy. We tell you creating the fundamentals of long-term growth in Africa is always going to outweigh pushing people into poverty now, when they will eventually recover when the trade war ends, and then they will now have a much bolstered economy. Go to their trade war. They drop a few key responses. One is the response that even if they create deals, the trade war still ebbs and flows because the Trump administration and Xi are still both preparing escalation, and that there will always be new administrations that are going to come to end that trade war. It's still only temporary. Then second of all, they cold drop the response that most of the American public still does not know enough what the BRI is. They have to prove the bright line, that enough of the American public knows that the EU joined the BRI, that it becomes a good electoral strategy, whereas otherwise it wasn't. They don't meet this bright line. They cannot prove it's a good electoral strategy. And we tell you, in fact, it's the opposite, because we're dependent on China's economy. You cause economic harm makes it a bad electoral strategy. Then their impact is 900 million people. Remember, that's only just as bad as the 2008 recession. They don't prove it's as bad as that. Then, go to our case. How are we winning? Right now, Africa's 50 million short of jobs. They're entering a window of opportunity where we must give them job growth so that they can capitalize on their human capital. How do we do this? We do this through the $2.5 trillion of the EU fund. They do not contest that the EU will fund because we tell you it will mitigate risk. That's really important because it's scalar. Because even if Chinese investment is going down, the Chinese investment will eventually recover. The only difference is whether or not you have this additional source of European funding that will be there forever if you vote APP. That's really important because we tell you that they really need this investment, as you can create 418 million jobs to grow the economy by 3.35% in the long run if you have this investment. How do we outweigh their case? First of all, we outweigh their case on the long term, but beyond that, we tell you this is both short term and long term, because as they eventually develop, they have this second window of opportunity. If they cannot meet the bright line of proving that Trump will uniquely do these tariffs, if you have any doubts about whether or not there will be one recession, you should always be defaulting to the side that has proven that has proven that we can create sustainable long-term growth that will lift an entire continent out of its current situation. Thus, we urge you to oppose.